Sinister Stories.
Dr. Elias Hargrove was a man of science, methodical and unwavering in his adherence to protocol. His reputation as a skilled and dedicated physician was well earned, having saved countless lives during his 20-year career. He prided himself on his meticulous attention to detail, knowing that even the smallest oversight could have catastrophic consequences. But as with all men, there were days when the weight of his responsibilities pressed heavily upon him, and mistakes, even for someone as precise as Dr. Hargrove, were inevitable. On a particularly grueling Tuesday, Dr. Hargrove found himself inundated with patients. From the moment he stepped into his clinic at 8 a.m., the waiting room was filled with the ailing and anxious. The hours passed in a blur of consultations, diagnoses, and prescriptions. By the time his last patient of the day, Mrs. Lila Crowley, arrived, Dr. Hargrove was exhausted. Mrs. Crowley was a regular, a frail, elderly woman in her 70s who had been battling various ailments for years. Her list of conditions was as long as his arm: hypertension, arthritis, and most recently, a persistent cough that had turned into a severe respiratory infection. She shuffled into his office, her breathing labored and eyes dim with fatigue. "Good evening, Mrs. Crowley," Dr. Hargrove greeted her, masking his weariness with a professional smile. "What seems to be the trouble today?" "The cough, doctor," she wheezed. "It's getting worse. I can't sleep, I can't eat. I'm so tired." Dr. Hargrove conducted a thorough examination, noting the crackling in her lungs and the pallor of her skin. It was clear she needed a stronger medication than what she was currently on. After some consideration, he decided to prescribe her a stronger antibiotic, one he was confident would finally knock out the infection. He scribbled out the prescription on his pad, his normally neat handwriting slightly hurried. The phrase, "prescribe as written," did not make it onto the paper, a small but crucial detail he usually never forgot. Handing her the slip, he offered a reassuring smile. "Take this to the pharmacy, Mrs. Crowley. It should help you feel better soon." "Thank you, doctor," she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. Mrs. Crowley left the clinic, the prescription clutched tightly in her hand. Dr. Hargrove exhaled heavily, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly as the door closed behind her. He tidied his desk and left the office, looking forward to a quiet evening at home. But the quiet would be short-lived. The next morning, Dr. Hargrove arrived at the clinic to find an unusual sense of unease in the air. His receptionist, Mary, greeted him with a troubled expression. "Good morning, doctor," she said hesitantly. There's something you should know." "What is it, Mary?" he asked, already sensing the gravity in her tone. "Mrs. Crowley's daughter called this morning. She said her mother had a terrible reaction to the medication you prescribed. She's in the hospital." Dr. Hargrove's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "She took the pills last night and got very sick. The doctors at the hospital are trying to stabilize her, but it's serious." Without another word, Dr. Hargrove grabbed his coat and rushed to the hospital. His mind raced with possibilities. Had he prescribed the wrong medication? Had Mrs. Crowley misunderstood his instructions? He needed to know what went wrong. At the hospital, Dr. Hargrove found Mrs. Crowley's daughter, Rachel, pacing the hallway outside the intensive care unit. Her face was etched with worry and anger. "Dr. Hargrove," she snapped, her voice trembling, "what did you give my mother?" "I prescribed an antibiotic," he replied, struggling to keep his composure. "What exactly happened?" "The pharmacist gave her a different medication. They said it was just as effective, but it clearly wasn't. She started convulsing and couldn't breathe." Dr. Hargrove's heart sank. The phrase, "prescribe as written," echoed in his mind, its absence now glaringly obvious. "Rachel, I am so sorry. I should have specified for the pharmacist to follow my exact prescription. This is my fault." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, her anger giving way to despair. "Just save her, doctor, please." Dr. Hargrove nodded and hurried to find Mrs. Crowley's attending physician. In the ICU, he saw her lying in the hospital bed, her frail body hooked up to various machines, fighting for every breath. The attending physician, Dr. Lisa Chen, briefed him on her condition. "She's in critical condition," Dr. Chen said. "The medication she was given caused a severe allergic reaction. We're doing everything we can, but it's touch and go." Dr. Hargrove spent the next few hours by Mrs. Crowley's side, consulting with the medical team and racking his brain for anything that might help her. He felt the crushing weight of his mistake, knowing that his oversight had brought her to this point. Days passed in a blur of anxiety and desperation. Mrs. Crowley's condition remained precarious, her life hanging by a thread. Dr. Hargrove barely slept, consumed by guilt and the drive to make things right. Then, one evening, as he sat by her bedside, something strange happened. Mrs. Crowley's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a clarity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Dr. Hargrove," she whispered, her voice unnaturally strong, "you must listen to me." "I'm here, Mrs. Crowley," he said, leaning closer. "What is it?" "I had a dream," she said, her eyes fixed on his. "A dark figure came to me. It said your mistake was not just an error, it was a gateway." "A gateway? To what?" "To something otherworldly. It said there are consequences for breaking the natural order. It warned me that a shadow would follow you, Doctor, a shadow that seeks retribution." Dr. Hargrove's blood ran cold. "Mrs. Crowley, you're very ill. You might be hallucinating." "No," she insisted, her grip on his hand surprisingly strong. "This is real. You must be careful. The shadow, it's coming for you." Before he could respond, she fell back into unconsciousness, leaving Dr. Hargrove with her ominous words echoing in his mind. He tried to dismiss them as the ramblings of a delirious mind, but a deep-seated fear took root in his heart. The next few days were a nightmare. Mrs. Crowley remained in the ICU, her condition fluctuating between critical and stable. Dr. Hargrove couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if a dark presence loomed over him. He found himself glancing over his shoulder, his nerves frayed and his mind haunted by Mrs. Crowley's warning. One night, as he was locking up the clinic, he heard a faint whisper. He turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. His heart pounded as he hurried to his car, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist around him. The drive home was tense, every dark corner and passing car a potential threat. At home, he found little comfort. The once familiar surroundings felt alien and oppressive. The shadows in his house seemed darker, the silence heavier. As he lay in bed, he heard the whisper again, closer this time, and distinctly saying his name. Elias. He bolted upright, his eyes scanning the room. Nothing, just darkness and silence. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching him, waiting. The days blurred into one another, his paranoia growing. He doubled his efforts at work, trying to lose himself in his patience and routine, but the sense of being pursued never left him. He started seeing fleeting shadows out of the corner of his eye, shadows that moved unnaturally, always disappearing when he turned to confront them. His colleagues began to notice his haggard appearance and jittery demeanor, but he brushed off their concerns with forced smiles and vague reassurances. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Dr. Hargrove stayed late at the clinic to catch up on paperwork. The building was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of the fluorescent lights and the scratching of his pen on paper. As the hours dragged on, his eyes grew heavy, and he found himself nodding off at his desk. He awoke with a start to the sound of a soft, rhythmic tapping. Blinking blearily, he glanced at the clock on the wall. It was past midnight. The tapping continued, echoing through the empty clinic. Heart pounding, he stood and followed the sound down the dimly lit hallway. It led him to exam room 3, the door slightly ajar. He hesitated, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Gathering his courage, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. "Elias!" The whisper was right next to his ear, so close he could feel the breath on his skin. He spun around, but the room was empty. Fear tightened his chest as he backed out of the room, his eyes darting around for any sign of movement. He nearly ran down the hallway, intent on grabbing his things and leaving the clinic, but as he reached the reception area, the lights flickered and went out. Plunged into darkness, he fumbled for his phone, the small beam of light from its screen barely piercing the blackness. The shadows seemed to press in on him, and the whisper came again, closer, more insistent. "Elias, you cannot escape." He stumbled towards the exit, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as he reached the door, a figure loomed in front of him, a tall, dark silhouette blocking his path. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and Dr. Hargrove felt a paralyzing terror wash over him. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The figure did not respond, but a wave of cold washed over him, seeping into his bones. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very essence of fear had taken form before him. With a sudden, desperate burst of energy, he pushed past the figure and out the door, sprinting to his car. He drove home in a daze, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. When he finally reached the safety of his house, he locked all the doors and windows, his heart still racing. The night was long and sleepless, filled with the ever-present sense of being watched. The next morning, Dr. Hargrove made a decision. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might be able to provide them. He paid a visit to Mrs. Crowley. When he arrived at her room, he found Rachel sitting by her mother's bedside, looking weary but hopeful. Mrs. Crowley's condition had improved slightly, though she was still weak and frail. "Dr. Hargrove," Rachel greeted him with a tired smile. "Thank you for coming." "I had to," he replied, his eyes on Mrs. Crowley. "I need to speak with her. It's important." Rachel nodded and gently shook her mother awake. Mrs. Crowley's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at Dr. Hargrove with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Doctor," she whispered, "it's you." "Mrs. Crowley," he said urgently, "I need to know more about the shadow you spoke of. What did it say? What does it want?" She closed her eyes, her breath shaky. "It said that your mistake opened a door. It wants retribution for the lives that have been tampered with, the natural order disrupted." "How do I stop it?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "You must find the source," she replied. "A source," he replied. Then in a deep whisper, Mrs. Crowley replied this not the first time. She then fell back to a deep sleep. Dr. Hargrove left the hospital with a heavy heart, his mind racing with possibilities. The source, what could it be? He retraced his steps, thinking back to the day he wrote the fateful prescription. There had to be something, some clue he had missed. As the days continued to pass, the shadow's presence grew more oppressive. It haunted his every waking moment, a constant, dark specter at the edge of his vision. He delved into his medical records, his notes, searching for anything that might point to the source of the malevolent force. One night, as he pored over his files in his study, he came across a name that sent a chill down his spine: Jonathan Crenshaw. He had almost forgotten about Crenshaw, a patient who had died under mysterious circumstances a year earlier. Crenshaw had been on a similar medication to the one he had prescribed Mrs. Crowley, and there had been rumors of malpractice, whispers that Dr. Hargrove had ignored crucial symptoms. Determined to uncover the truth, Dr. Hargrove visited the hospital where Crenshaw had been treated. He accessed the old records and discovered discrepancies in the dosage and administration of the medication. It seemed that Crenshaw had been given the wrong dosage, much like Mrs. Crowley. His investigation led him to a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, Crenshaw's last known address. The house was a relic of the past, its windows boarded up and the garden overgrown with weeds. Dr. Hargrove hesitated at the gate, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. He pushed open the creaking gate and made his way to the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. Dust motes floated in the air, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Inside, the house was a time capsule of Crenshaw's life, old photographs, yellowed papers, and personal belongings scattered about. Dr. Hargrove searched the rooms, looking for anything that might explain the connection to the shadow. In a small study, he found a journal, its pages filled with Crenshaw's neat handwriting. As he read, a chilling story unfolded. Crenshaw had been obsessed with the concept of balance and retribution, believing that every action had a corresponding consequence. He had books of dark magic and practices, seeking to invoke a force that would right the wrongs he perceived in the world. Dr. Hargrove's hands shook as he realized the full extent of what had happened. Crenshaw's death had been the catalyst, his final act of summoning the shadow that now pursued him. The shadow was a manifestation of Crenshaw's twisted sense of justice, seeking to punish those who had erred. The journal detailed the ritual, the incantations, and the final sacrifice that had bound the shadow to this world. Dr. Hargrove knew what he had to do. He had to reverse the ritual, sever the connection, and send the shadow back to the void. Armed with the knowledge from Crenshaw's journal, he gathered the necessary items and returned to his clinic, the place where his mistake had first opened the door. The building was eerily quiet as he set up the ritual, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. He lit the candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. He recited the incantations, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. As he spoke the final words, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting around him. Elias. The whisper was everywhere, surrounding him. Dr. Hargrove took a deep breath and completed the ritual, the final incantation ringing out in the silence. The shadows surged, a violent wind whipping through the room, extinguishing the candles. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness and a crushing sense of dread. Then, slowly, the darkness began to lift. The oppressive weight that had hung over him for weeks seemed to dissipate, the shadows retreating. Dr. Hargrove collapsed to his knees, exhaustion and relief washing over him. But as he knelt there, catching his breath, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Had he truly severed the connection, or had he simply bought himself a reprieve? The shadow had been a force of balance, a twisted sense of retribution. Could such a force ever be fully vanquished? Dr. Hargrove knew that he could never be certain. The shadow might return, seeking revenge, or it might lie in wait, biding its time. As he left the clinic, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, Dr. Hargrove knew that his life would never be the same. The shadow's warning echoed in his mind, a reminder of the delicate balance between life and death, order and chaos. And somewhere, in the deep recesses of his mind, he felt the lingering presence of the shadow, a cold reminder that some mistakes could never be undone. The weeks that followed were a return to normalcy, or at least a semblance of it. Mrs. Crowley's condition stabilized, and she was eventually discharged from the hospital. She moved in with Rachel, who took on the role of her primary caregiver. Dr. Hargrove continued to practice medicine, but his once unwavering confidence had been replaced with a constant sense of caution. Then, one night, as he was closing up the clinic, the familiar tapping began again. He froze, the sound sending a chill down his spine. His heart pounded as he moved toward exam room 3, his breath shallow and quick. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been before. He pushed it open with a trembling hand. Inside, the room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. The tapping ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stepped inside. "Elias!" The whisper was right next to his ear, so close he could feel the breath on his skin. He spun around, but the room was empty. Fear tightened his chest as he backed out of the room, his eyes darting around for any sign of movement. He nearly ran down the hallway, intent on grabbing his things and leaving the clinic, but as he reached the reception area, the lights flickered and went out. Plunged into darkness, he fumbled for his phone, the small beam of light from its screen barely piercing the blackness. The shadows seemed to press in on him, and the whisper came again, closer, more insistent. "Elias, you cannot escape." He stumbled towards the exit, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as he reached the door, a figure loomed in front of him, a tall, dark silhouette blocking his path. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and Dr. Hargrove felt a paralyzing terror wash over him. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "Elias!" Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a single, towering figure. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and it reached out with a hand made of darkness. "You cannot escape!" it intoned, its voice echoing with 1,000 whispers. "You opened the door! Now you must pay the price!" Dr. Hargrove's heart raced as he realized the truth. There was no escaping the shadow. It was bound to him, a permanent reminder of his mistake. He had tampered with the natural order, and now the balance had to be restored. The shadow's grip tightened, and Dr. Hargrove felt his strength ebbing away. He struggled, but it was futile. The darkness enveloped him, and his last thought was of the lives he had tried to save, the patients who had trusted him. As the shadow consumed him, the clinic fell silent. The candles flickered and went out, leaving the room in darkness. Dr. Hargrove was gone, swallowed by the very force he had unleashed, and somewhere in the depths of the shadows, a figure with burning eyes waited, its whispers echoing in the darkness. Elias, written as prescribed.